Today's program is focusing on one of the 7 deadly cardinal sins, and that's envy. And we'll be talking about the role that it plays, perhaps, in our politics. Let me first introduce one of our guests, Dr. Julie Fratantoni. Dr. Fratantoni earned her Ph.D. in cognitive neuroscience at University of Texas at Dallas, and she's now head of operations for the Brain Health Project at the Center for Brain Health here in Dallas, Texas as well. Her research focuses on a longitudinal study that looks at not just our brain health and how we can improve the function of our brain today, but throughout our entire lifespan. And I think you'll find the conversation today really very interesting. Dennis, would you go ahead and please introduce Ann Hendershott, and let's get started.
Well, as you said, Jim, Ann Hendershott is with us. She's also a PhD. She's a professor of sociology at Franciscan University. And she's written a bunch of books, but particularly the one we're going to talk about today is called The Politics of Envy. Tell that viewer what envy is and why we talk about it in terms of the politics of envy.
Well, envy is it's a frightening emotion, and I've been fascinated by it for a long time. It's a feeling that someone has something that you don't have, and you don't think they should have it. It's different from greed in that the emotion of greed is you want things that others have, perhaps. But envy takes it a step further in that you may not even want what they have, but you don't want them to have it. You want them to lose whatever it is that you don't want them to have. And that's what envy is really all about.
Well, that is the insidious nature of envy. And so I want you, our viewer, to pay particular attention to how this relates to today's politics and politics of the past and probably the future. Jim asked the question about sort of it being the worst of the deadly sins. Why is that, Ann?
Well, because it could corrupt an individual, but worse, it can corrupt a whole society and even a country. I think you're seeing that played out in Cuba right now. Envy is really the source of, I see it as the source of all evil. And I go to the Bible in my book a little bit in the beginning because it's so insidious. We're not even aware of it. But I decided to write the book because I saw envy just permeating the politics leading up to the 2020 election. You couldn't hear one of the candidates without having them do this bid to envy, like the fat cats and the rich, and really inviting people to envy. And you're seeing it every day. The guillotine has made its way back. I'm sure your listeners are aware of the French Revolution and the guillotine. That's a symbol of envy, in that the idea of kill the rich, off with their heads, eat the rich. And we saw a lot of that in the election. And that's really the reason I decided to write this book.
Well, I think it was a great thing. And we talked about a previous book written over 25 years ago by Doug Bandow with the same title, basically a different subtitle, but The Politics of Envy. And it's not just one political party, is it, Ann? And give us some examples of how both political parties use that particular emotion to try to get support.
And if I could interject here, I know in your book you compared FDR with Trump, and how they both use the politics of envy, and maybe you could elaborate on that.
Yes, they both did. The idea of demonizing the other side as having things that you don't have. On the left, they usually do it in terms of wealth and fat cats. And the reason that you're not up further is because the rich people are stepping on you and keeping you down. President Trump used a different tactic in that he wants people to envy us. And he kind of did a bid to envy. I don't see that as quite as evil as the other, but they both are very negative, certainly. But he often talked about how we should be the envy of others. And that's really prideful. Instead of lifting all boats, he kind of wants to lift our boats higher. So you can understand the rhetoric from the left in that if your boat's higher, there's other people who are not doing as well, perhaps. So both sides use it.
I'd like you to explain and describe the difference between envy and jealous and maybe how you emulate, because I'm looking there at Dennis and, I would have said a few weeks ago, I'm really envious of that head of hair, but, I'm not trying to take it away from him. Maybe I would, but,
Jealousy is, it can be almost, I wouldn't want to say it's a good emotion, but it can be benign in that when when you love someone very much, you would get jealous of another person or worried that you would lose that person. Envy is very different. Envy would be in a love relationship, someone else has someone that you might want, and or you may not even want that person, but you just don't want that person to have it. I mean, think of Shakespeare and Othello, think of Iago, the evil eye, causing all that trouble. He was very jealous, but also that went to envy, because sometimes jealousy can spill over into envy in that you want to destroy that person. And that's what happens.
Now, Julie, let me bring you in here because I think it's fair to say that we all have this envy in us. And the Center for Brain Health does such great stuff there. Tell us a little bit about how the brain works with this particular emotion and what we need to understand about it.
Sure. So there's really no one single spot in the brain that's responsible for envy alone. The brain works in networks, and so multiple regions communicating with each other, and that's especially what we see for emotions. Interestingly, some of the research shows that there's increased activation in a part of the brain called the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex. So that's a part kind of deep within the brain, and that part of the brain is responsible for cognitive dissonance. So really showing that when people are envious, there's sort of a dissonance that they're experiencing between, what they think is right or what they think that person should have. The other thing that some of the literature shows with envy and brain activation is actually decreased activity in reward-related circuits. So we know the reward system has a lot to do with dopamine and motivation factors, and how we can kind of relate to the world around us or motivate us to explore or interact with other people. And so there's actually decreases in that system with envy.
So is there a way, I think you said you really can't measure the degree of envy. You can't really pinpoint it. Is that correct?
Yeah, it would be difficult to I think you could definitely measure levels of activation in certain circuits or regions that have been associated with that. But for example, envy is kind of a mediator when it comes to social media and well-being. Like that you could measure sort of how that's going to mediate or moderate other effects. So there's a lot of different ways to get at it.
Are there tools that we might use, self-help, if we felt that we were, envious of something, that we might work in our own mind to ameliorate that? Absolutely.
I mean, the good thing about the brain is that because of neuroplasticity and its ability to change based on our behaviors, that you could, if you chose to be intentional and practice certain strategies or engage more in compassion, or even practicing things like emotional regulation of when that emotion comes up, learning how to regulate that, kind of dampen the limbic emotional system and bring your frontal cortex online so you can reason and make better judgments in planning. So there's a lot of ways that you can choose to combat that if you want, and really how you choose to use your brain every day, and even kind of being aware of how you maybe are subconsciously patterns that you've established, that you can really work towards combating that if you're recognizing that envy is causing destruction in your own life.
And that's some of the work that you do at the center, I guess.
Yes, absolutely. We specialize in teaching people cognitive strategies to really be their best self.
Well, Julie, I'm glad to hear that something can be done about it. But Anne, unfortunately, Jim and I have talked to a lot of people in the last couple of years about let's just say the anger and the divisiveness in politics today. And one of those things that comes out that sort of exacerbates the problem is something that you may be familiar with because you wrote about it. It's called social media. Talk to us about how envy plays into that and how we should be concerned about that politically.
Yeah, that can be a pretty toxic place. And in my book, I call the people who sort of sow the seeds of envy, I call them envy farmers, because they post things designed to create envy toward them. And people, there's a lot of research, I'm sure Julie knows about this research because she probably works with people who do that. the more you are on social media and the more you're exposed to other people's fabulous vacations and wonderful relationships, the more your anxiety increases, and for some, envy increases. Envy, I'm a sociologist, so I talk about the social construction of envy, but I'm also a Christian, and I kind of believe that it's part of original sin. I think we're born with this, and there are evolutionary biologists who believe that envy could be an adaptive mechanism, where if somebody who is faster could be a better hunter, so you might envy their hunting prowess and try to take that away so you could get the big game. So it could be hardwired. I'm not sure. I'm not an evolutionary biologist, and Julie can speak to this perhaps. But if you have a 2-year-old in your life and a new baby is born, you see envy immediately. That baby's getting more attention. Then when that baby gets older, wants a certain toy because you want that toy. We see it a lot.
Why is it so hard for us to divorce ourselves from something that really is, frankly, nefarious at times?
Yeah, when it comes to social media and the brain, it's tapping into our reward system. So every time you get a new notification, you're getting a burst of dopamine. It's reinforcing that behavior. It's really hard to get out of it. There was a study that I came across that was done in China actually a few years ago, and it looked at the role of kind of just this passive social media consumption and really how envy was a mediator for well-being. So, and then specifically with gender, it actually that was moderated, but it was a stronger effect for females. So interesting to note for potential interventions or, ways to help set people up for success better, to know that they might be more prone to that, or that may be a bigger pitfall for them.
And how do you see it?
Social media is a problem, but it also can be helpful if people, as Julie said, are aware of the triggers that they have. I mean, if I write an article and I post it, I feel happy when people like it. So I understand that attraction, but when people go to other sites and they see that other people are liking those sites more and their articles more or their vacations more, it creates a real problem in terms of their self-concept. I think that social media can be very damaging and should be limited.
I recently watched The Social Contract, and it's interesting that the titans of social media don't let their children participate. So, I suspect all of us, to some degree, are against a lot of government intervention, but should we have more regulation of this? Or how do we put the genie back into the bottle?
Well, I think like anything, social media, it's a tool. So like anything, it's how you choose to use it. I think that there is I think there needs to be a little bit of both. There's kind of my independent ownership over myself, and then as a parent, how you want to guide your children in that. And then also for companies, what they're creating, and are they incentivized to create productive humans or to create people that are, addicted and zombified and, envious? I think that there are ways that they, tweaks that they can make that can help support the goal of improving humanity.
Well, I think one of the things, Julie, that obviously studying the brain and the Center for Brain Health is doing is letting us know more about this. And because, Anne, as you said in your book, people don't like to talk about envy. But let me ask you to shift just a bit, because in your book and in the other books I've read about envy is not always just bad. There are some positive aspects to envy if we can recognize them.
You mentioned Shook sees that, and Durkheim thinks that the possibility of people envying us might help us control our behavior. I don't necessarily see the positive aspects of envy. In fact, I think envy is a very dangerous emotion. I have a whole chapter on the crimes of envy, and I write about this nanny that was taking care of adorable little children, but she was so envious of the mother having so much and her having so little that it actually ended up murdering the children. It was the nanny murders in New York City. I wrote about the whole story, and the judge in the case mentioned the word envy several times. The prosecutor mentioned the word envy. Crimes of envy are horrible. A lot of crimes of arson are crimes of envy, vindictiveness, and social media inflames that kind of envy. I think a lot of the rioting stems from envy. I think the crimes against Asian Americans in the big cities right now stem from envy. So I don't see envy as a positive, the way Schick does.
Schick does mention that, because I think what he says, and correct me if I'm wrong, Ann, is he says that envy to some extent keeps people who have more, let's just say more good looks like Jim and me, or more money, as some people have. It keeps us from, let's say, being too braggadocious about it. It lets people understand that being too confident about their money or their self-worth or their knowledge or whatever keeps them from lording it over other people. Do you see that, Ann? I know you read that in the book.
I did write about that. And there are some cultures where they don't say anything good about anything. If you go to some countries, Greek culture, Russian culture, they don't like to brag about anything because people will envy them and try to destroy them. That's what they think. And they're probably right, because there are some cultures, if you bring people into your home and show them what you have, you're endangering yourself.
But, and what is the driving force in our psychology that makes us want to do better, to achieve more? Because if I see someone who is more accomplished than I am, or is a better manager or better on TV, I want to improve. I want to emulate. Now, that's not being envy. What is that?
That's a good thing. Emulation is wonderful. You don't want to have that person brought down. You want to get up to that level. That's a good thing, and that's emulation. Admiration.
So that's emulation.
Yes.
You know, you touched on this just a second ago, and you elaborate in your book, and darn, I wish we had more time to really go into your book, and I hope people will read it. But the difference, the way Russians and Americans view envy, touch on that.
Yeah, I think it's kind of sad. We have a very good friend who's a model, and she says that nobody in her hometown is happy for her. She's been on billboards in Times Square, and in a Betsy Johnson ad. She's a big model, like Armani show is big. And she said that when she won this modeling contract when she was just 14 years old, nobody was happy for her, including her extended family. But that's the way Russian culture is, she told me, that they can't be happy. And I get into in the chapter about why certain cultures are envy driven. I think some of it has to do with the Soviet Union, but it's way before that, with the Tsar. I mean, we have to go way back. We're becoming an envy culture, I think, in this culture. The idea of a guillotine in front of Jeff Bezos' house worries me a little bit. You know, not that we're all going to have our heads chopped off, but the rhetoric.
Yeah, and you mentioned that in terms of Russian. Let me move you just a little bit further west to talk about a guy who, by the way, his hometown was flooded last week in Germany, but his name was Karl Marx, as I recall. And that philosophy obviously got into Russia through a guy named Lenin. But you talked about in your book this Marxist ideology and how this sort of leads to this problem that we have right now. Can you elaborate on that a bit?
Yes, any Marxist society has envy at its basis. And I know people have argued with me about that, but I can't really tone that down at all. I mean, let's look at the Sandinistas. When they marched into Managua, the first thing they did was take all the generals took all the best houses for themselves. That's what happens in any Marxist takeover. It's based on envy. They want to get what other people have. If you've ever read Boris Pasternak's Dr. Zhivago about the Russian Revolution, now that's fiction, I know, but there is some truth in that. The idea of bringing people down because they have too much and you have too little. Just like the nanny. We're seeing it in cultures, we're seeing it in individuals, and I think our culture is going in that direction. It worries me greatly.
And when you're talking about what changes we're seeing in our culture, one is cancel culture. Hearing and reading stories about that every day. How does envy play into that?
Resentment, I think. Resentment. Because I see cancel culture, I've been seeing it. I've been teaching for 30 years and very successful professors. I've never been canceled, but we call it mobbing in academia. If somebody is really successful, students love him. This happened at Providence College, and I write about it in the book. People go after them, other faculty, and bring him down. This one friend of mine, Anthony Esselin, there was a group with the megaphone telling him to resign, faculty and administrators. faculty initiate these mobbing actions to get people out. So I've been in cancel culture for years now, and it's usually a high status person that others want to bring down. I mean, you see it every day with celebrities. Yeah, cancel culture is a real problem. It's just called cancel. It's been other names. We call it mobbing in academia because it comes from the idea of bird world, little birds mobilizing to bring down a big bird. Because if there's a hawk that's preying on tiny little songbirds, the songbirds can kill that hawk if they harass him and zoom in, if they mobilize. And that's what happens with these big hawks on college campuses who are mobbed by little hawks, little birds who just pick away at him until he leaves.
And now with the megaphone of social media, it's even harder.
Worse. Yeah, mobbing is much worse with social media.
What other professional sectors, if you wish, that you see this as an issue?
You don't see it in business as much because they're so concerned about the bottom line. I mean, certainly but Hollywood, I think we'll all agree that that's anybody who steps out of line or gets too big for their britches, as people used to say, they're in danger of being mobbed. And we've seen it or canceled.
Julie, we just have a few minutes left, but for that person watching who either has a friend or a relative or him or herself, preferably, what should we do to overcome this? Once we understand that this is a problem, is there a way that we can either self-cure or go to the Center for Brain Health? I went to the Center for Brain Health, as you may know. They did an exploratory operation to see if I had one. That was one of the things that you did, and it was not overly successful. But what can we do?
Yeah, we have an exciting project going on right now called the Brain Health Project. And this is an opportunity really to learn about your own brain and to think about your own thinking and teach you strategies for how to do that. So whether your goals are to be less envious or to be more efficient in your work or to have better relationships, all the different ways you use your brain, you have the potential to always improve and to enhance that. So we're equipping people with those strategies, and it's an entirely online platform that people can access. So yeah, definitely check that out. And that's something that's for people ages 18 to 100.
Okay. Well, you encompass Jim and me, but barely. And from your standpoint, from a political standpoint, I have friends who disagree with me vehemently about political issues. Some of them, once I confront them with the facts, just go away. Others, I'm happy to say, engage and talk about things, et cetera. And I think as long as we're doing it in a civilized way, we seem to be better off. But some people have a hard time doing that. Any suggestions?
Well, I think I always say I say in the book that it takes a heroic attitude to reject the envy culture. It really does. When people are envying you or envying your situation, perhaps, be aware of it and be kind. I guess that's easier said than done, but the resentment that this culture is involved in right now, that we're seeing on our streets in Seattle and we saw it in the White House on January 6th, I see as driven by envy. And it's going to take a real heroic attitude for people to look at this and say, why did we participate in anything like this? Because I think people are still in denial.
And one thing that I particularly enjoyed about your book was just how you had at least one, if not two chapters tracing the evolution of envy through literature, from Adam and Eve, the Bible, up to Shakespeare, and even up to Herman Melville's Billy Budd. We have just another minute and a half left. Tell us about how Melville incorporated envy into Billy Budd and what we should learn from that.
Yeah, I love that story of Billy Budd.
I did too.
The handsome sailor, very innocent, good. People loved Billy Budd, except for the one person who envied him so terribly that he ended up causing his own death. Not just the death of Billy Budd, but his own death. Because that's the thing with envy. It's a double edge. You hurt the person you're envying and you're hurting yourself at the same. There is no pleasure in envy. Nobody gets any pleasure, neither the envier or the one being envied. There's no joy in that. But yeah, storybooks, it's good to teach your children the fairy tales like Cinderella, the ugly stepsisters who envy the beautiful and good Cinderella. Those are great stories where children can learn what happens to people who envy. I mean, in the original Cinderella, the ugly stepsisters get their eyes pecked out. And that's what Dante reminds us, in the.
That's a really good point, and I have 5 grandchildren. I think I'll be more conscious of what books I may read to them. I want to thank both of you, Dennis, and I want to thank both of you for being with us. You've really opened our eyes, and I want to encourage people and to read your book and learn more about Julie's research. Good luck with it, Julie. It's really tremendous what you're doing, so that all of us can improve the work of our brains. Let's help them function. And Dennis and I want to thank all of you, our viewers, for spending part of your day with us. With you, we certainly enjoy talking about things that matter with people who care. And we'll see you again very, very soon.